Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're checking out another 4K 144Hz gaming monitor, following on from our review of the Gigabyte M28U last week. I was super impressed with what Gigabyte brought to the table in one of the most affordable 4K high refresh packages I'd seen yet, so I'm pretty keen to check out Asus's alternative in today's review. Unfortunately, unlike the simply named Gigabyte M28U, Asus doesn't seem to have gotten the message about monitor naming, calling their version the Tough Gaming VG28UQL1A. That letters and numbers soup extends to 9 characters and is one of the harder monitor names to say, so get your act together, Asus. I'm betting some customers won't be able to get this name right when searching on store pages like Newegg, which I'd gather is probably pretty important. Anyway, what we're looking at is a 28-inch 4K IPS monitor with a 144Hz maximum refresh rate and adaptive sync support through NVIDIA G-Sync compatible and AMD FreeSync Premium. From what I can tell, this monitor uses the same Innolux panel as the M28U, so it'll be interesting to see how it compares from a performance perspective. Certainly on the spec sheet, it's very similar down to features like 300 nits of brightness, display HDR 400 certification for HDR, 1 millisecond rated response times, and 90% DCI-P3 coverage. This monitor hasn't quite launched on the market yet, so I don't have any firm US pricing, but I do know it will go on sale in September for $960 Australian dollars. That should convert to a US price tag between $600 and $700 US, so it too is one of the more affordable 4K gaming monitors on the market. Before taking a closer look at the design, the VG28UQL1A includes one very important feature for new 4K gaming monitors, and that's support for HDMI 2.1. In fact, the port selection included here is generous, with 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, 2 HDMI 2.0 ports, and DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC. Both the DP 1.4 and HDMI 2.1 connectors support the full 4K 144Hz experience, which is great news for use with the latest consoles and PC GPUs. And then on top of that, you get 2 extra HDMI ports for other devices. Throw in some USB ports and built-in speakers, and there should be plenty of connectivity. As this is a tough gaming monitor, it sits in Asus's mainstream lineup and therefore has a simpler design than Asus's top-end ROG monitors, though to be honest, I actually prefer this sort of design. It uses a more neutral color tone, which I think works better with most gaming setups. The rear still has some gamer-influenced design, but doesn't look as crazy, and there's no RGB LED lighting to unnecessarily inflate the price. Most of the outer construction is a simple black plastic, and that's fine. Despite using a cheaper, simpler design, the display retains all of the ergonomic features we enjoy from higher-end products. That includes height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustment, so you can even use the VG28UQL1A in a portrait orientation without the need for a VESA mount. For what it is, it's a pretty sturdy stand, and the V-shaped legs don't occupy too much space on your desk. Asus's standard OSD is included here, accessible through a directional toggle on the rear, along with some dedicated buttons for quick access to some of the features. Asus provides a pretty good set of features here, among the best I've seen from gaming monitors, including quite a number of gaming-specific features like crosshairs, FPS counters, and even a sniper mode that zooms in the center of the screen. Asus label these as practice mode features, but we all know these are used for cheating. Next up is a look at response time performance, and Asus are offering their usual 6 overdrive settings, though on this occasion they are labeled as variable overdrive modes in the OSD. We'll start here with a look at level 0 at the display's maximum 144Hz refresh rate, and already we are seeing quite good performance. An average response time of 5.24 milliseconds is strong, although there is a small amount of overshoot even on the lowest overdrive mode. So like with Gigabyte's M28U, there isn't a mode that offers totally zero overshoot. Nevertheless, this level of inverse ghosting produced from overshoot artifacts is minimal and not that noticeable during gaming. Level 1 overdrive provides a slightly better experience. The average response time has fallen to 4.65 milliseconds, and inverse ghosting has only risen slightly, which gives us better cumulative deviation than the previous chart by a small margin. This suggests that level 1 is somewhat better than level 0 for gaming at the highest refresh rate. Then with level 2 overdrive, we start going backwards again. While the average response time has improved now to 4.13 milliseconds, so about a 0.5 millisecond reduction compared to level 1, inverse ghosting is more prevalent due to higher overshoot. Cumulative deviation shows us this balance between response times and overshoot, and with a higher value here than level 1, this mode isn't as optimal, though it's not that different to the previous 2 modes we've been looking at. Next up is level 3 overdrive, and here's where things begin to get noticeably worse than the lower 3 modes. Overshoot is increased significantly here to achieve the 3.45 millisecond response time average, which leads to inverse ghosting artifacts that are noticeable while gaming. I wouldn't recommend this mode, or really any of the higher modes, which see this trend fall further and further into the high overshoot zone. While the level 5 mode does see some transitions complete in as fast as 1 millisecond, which is what Asus claimed as the response time for this monitor, in practice the highest mode is unusable. So at the highest refresh rate, we know that level 1 is the optimal mode to use. So how does it fare for gaming across the entire refresh range? Well, pretty well for the most part. Response times are kept fairly consistent around the 4.6 millisecond mark, and while overshoot does increase as the refresh rate gets lower, inverse ghosting isn't super noticeable until we get to around 60 Hz. If you know you're going to be playing mostly around 60 Hz, you could switch to the lower level 0 mode to reduce overshoot slightly, but honestly it's quite a small difference, and I would just stick to using level 1 across the entire refresh range to get the benefit of slightly faster speeds at the high end of the refresh range. Like with Gigabyte's M28U, I am disappointed that Asus hasn't been able to integrate an overdrive mode with less overshoot at 60 Hz. Ideally there would be a mode below level 0 here. I also didn't see much evidence of variable overdrive in action. Now, I didn't design this display, so I don't know for sure how variable overdrive has been implemented, and there may be some areas where variable overdrive does engage, but I would expect the best variable overdrive implementations to better handle lower refresh rates than what we're seeing here. These are pretty minor nitpicks though, because in general the VG28UQL1A does have a single overdrive mode experience if you use any of the bottom 3 overdrive settings, which leads to a great experience for variable refresh rate gaming. It could be better in some areas, but there is no doubting this display has great motion performance for 4K gamers. When comparing the VG28UQL1A to other gaming monitors, this display delivers essentially the same performance as the Gigabyte M28U and several other IPS gaming monitors when comparing at the maximum refresh rate. The Asus model has slightly slower response times, but slightly less overshoot than the Gigabyte alternative, but either way you look at it, these displays are a step above monitors like the LG 27GN950 in terms of highest refresh rate performance. On average across the entire refresh range, there is nothing separating the Asus and Gigabyte variants of this 28-inch monitor. The margins we are talking about here are a fraction of a millisecond on average, which is totally negligible, so whichever of these displays you end up purchasing, you'll get great response time performance for an IPS monitor. Then we get to cumulative deviation, which shows the balance between response times and overshoot. We want the lowest cumulative deviation number possible, as that indicates the monitor is producing as close to the ideal response as it can. Again, there's really nothing separating the Asus and Gigabyte variants, which sit among most of today's high-performance IPS gaming monitor panels. At a fixed 120Hz, it looks pretty clear at this mode that the VG28UQL1A and M28U are virtually identical in terms of its overdrive tuning, because the results produced here are basically the same, not just in the averages but also in the overall response time charts. This means that for 120Hz gaming, say hooking up an Xbox Series X over HDMI 2.1, whether you go Asus or Gigabyte doesn't really matter at all. At 60 Hz, the Gigabyte alternative has a small performance advantage over the Asus model when using the best overdrive settings for both, but once again the margins here are small and don't really make that much impact on the visual experience. Both monitors have slightly too high inverse ghosting at this refresh rate in my opinion, even using the lowest overdrive settings. For input lag, the VG28UQL1A wasn't as solid as I would like to see, with a processing delay about 1 millisecond longer than the equivalent Gigabyte model. This doesn't make a huge difference for input latency overall, given we're talking about margins of mere milliseconds, and a 144Hz monitor will never give the best input lag overall, given 240Hz monitors are always superior. For power consumption, once again, no major differences between the VG28UQL1A and M28U. Both use the same panel, seem to otherwise have very similar hardware, so the results end up essentially identical. Asus do provide backlight strobing support here through ELMB sync. This means we can use backlight strobing either with or without a variable refresh rate enabled. Unfortunately, the implementation with adaptive sync enabled, so the full ELMB sync is poor to mediocre, with lots of strobed crosstalk even at the highest refresh rates. You can use the mode down to 85 Hz or so, but its ability to improve clarity over the regular mode without ELMB is limited. If anything, it's still a little bit blurry, just a different kind of blur to the regular mode. Gigabyte's AIM stabilizer sync feature on the M28U works noticeably better. However, for just regular ELMB usage with adaptive sync disabled, the quality of backlight strobing is very good. At times there can still be a faint double image and some strobe crosstalk, plus overshoot artifacts as Asus disables overdrive controls and seems to use a higher than optimal setting, but motion clarity is clearer using strobing than not, and Asus even provides several clarity and timing settings that you can tweak to your liking. Level 5 gives the clearest image, but the lowest display brightness. Like the ELMB sync mode, regular ELMB is also usable down to 85Hz, though there is noticeable overshoot at lower refresh rates. Overall, this is an okay backlight strobing feature, but there is plenty of room for improvement. Moving now into color performance, and the VG28UQL1A's color gamut was a little smaller than I was expecting at just 86% coverage of DCI-P3. When looking at total coverage of the wide Rec 2020, this monitor is the weakest of those in the chart, though not too dissimilar from the Gigabyte M28U, which makes sense as both monitors use the same Innolux panel technology. The level of wide gamut on offer here is not as strong as the best IPS panels we've seen, such as those from LG or AU Optronics. My unit's factory calibration was mediocre. Out of the box, the color temperature was a bit too warm, and gamma was incorrect in some areas, leading to a weak Delta E2000 average of 3.79 for grayscale. On top of this, there is no sRGB emulation mode enabled by default, so there is some level of oversaturation, nothing too crazy, but only modest Delta E results. When we compare this level of factory calibration to other displays, the Asus offering is clearly inferior to the Gigabyte M28U, which has put a lot more effort into great out-of-the-box results. While the Delta E average for color checker isn't too bad, it's still beaten by the M28U, which also has an excellent sRGB mode that is near perfect for accuracy. The VG28UQL1A also has an sRGB mode, which does clamp down the gamut to provide better Delta E results. However, its grayscale calibration falls short of what is required with many of the same problems as the default mode. Unfortunately, Asus also locked down the white balance controls in the sRGB mode, so there is no opportunity to further calibrate performance at a hardware level. Your other option for improving OSD performance is to use the normal mode but try and calibrate grayscale. Unfortunately, this didn't work out as well as I would like for me, as there's no way to properly correct the gamma performance. My thoughts after a full calibration are pretty similar to most other monitors of this type, where performance for sRGB content is excellent and you can easily fix most of the issues with grayscale and oversaturation. However, for wider gamut work, the actual gamut this monitor is capable of isn't really wide enough for DCI-P3 or Adobe RGB work, so it lacks that versatility as a dual-purpose gaming and creating display. Peak brightness for the VG28UQL1A is disappointing in the SDR mode at just 280 nits, below that of the M28U. I suspect this is due to the M28U requiring less calibration, which tends to better preserve native panel characteristics. The more calibration that's required, the more brightness and contrast tend to be impacted. Minimum brightness is nothing amazing either at 64 nits. Meanwhile, the contrast ratio is very similar to what I described in the brightness section, in that the increased amount of calibration required has hurt contrast more with this monitor than with the M28U. The VG28UQL1A sits at a bit below 1000:1 here, which is still close to the rated 1000:1 Asus advertises, but 6% lower than the M28U. This is despite both monitors having quite similar uncalibrated contrast ratios. The Asus model just gets impacted more from calibration. Viewing angles are excellent, no issues there. Uniformity with my unit was okay, particularly for whites, but not quite as good for grey uniformity. I also noticed some IPS glow on this monitor, more so than the Gigabyte equivalent, although this can vary between units, so it's a bit of a panel lottery type situation. Wrapping up the performance section of this review, I'll quickly touch on HDR performance. This display is only Display HDR 400 certified and lacks proper HDR hardware. It does get some of the way there with 8 edge-lit dimming zones, but doesn't get bright enough for me to class it as a semi-HDR monitor. 8 edge-lit zones is better than 0 edge-lit zones, but in practice the HDR experience is poor and not significantly different to an SDR display using an HDR turn curve with its brightness turned up. If I take the Asus TUF Gaming VG28UQL1A in isolation, it's a very good monitor. There's no doubt about that. Response time performance is excellent, leading to great motion clarity at 144Hz with few artifacts. This can be improved further through backlight strobing. Variable refresh rate support is excellent with a single overdrive mode experience, and it supports HDMI 2.1, making it a versatile 4K gaming display for PC and console gamers. On top of that, we're getting the benefits of IPS technology, including outstanding viewing angles, great text clarity, which is what you want at 4K, decent uniformity for the most part, and acceptable color quality. It's a nice flat panel, it's high resolution, it's high refresh rate, and it performs well in most key areas. Throw in that it's a value-oriented product, and there's definitely a lot to like here. Obviously though, when you buy a new monitor, you want to compare it to the other products on the market, and I think the VG28UQL1A has some strengths and weaknesses in this area. Its strengths are clear. This monitor is better than prior generation 4K displays, particularly those without HDMI 2.1. I seriously cannot recommend a 4K 144Hz monitor these days that's limited to just HDMI 2.0, so I would easily choose this display over models like LG's 27GN950, and you'll likely save some money in the process as the Asus model is more affordable. It performs really well too, on par or better than prior 4K gaming monitors in many key areas. Where the battle gets tough is comparing this display to other just released 28-inch 4K 144Hz displays that use the same Innolux panel, like the Gigabyte M28U. We've seen in this review that in many areas, the VG28UQL1A and M28U deliver essentially identical performance for things like response times, brightness, color gamut, and HDR, so which monitor is best comes down to price and features. In my opinion, this is where the Asus model falls short. The M28U has better factory calibration, better backlight strobing, and includes a KVM switch, which is a potentially useful addition to some setups. It's also cheaper. Here in Australia, the M28U goes for between $800 and $900, while the VG28UQL1A is set to debut at $960. This makes the Gigabyte model the better and cheaper display, so it's the clear choice for buyers. However, this is only a comparison in one corner of the market. Everything here really hinges on the price tag, and if the Asus model is the same price as the M28U or slightly cheaper, then the conversation is a bit different and it becomes much harder to pick. We're also expecting several other competitors using this same panel to launch in the coming months, so it could be worth keeping your eye out for those, and that will hopefully start a trend down in pricing. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you're interested in supporting our display testing, you can do so via the links in the description below to our Patreon or Floatplane accounts. If you sign up to those, you get access to the ICC profiles we generate during our calibration process. We also have our Discord community if you want to chat to us about anything. Got monthly live streams, all that sort of good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.